All right. Now, when I was a teenager, I used to live in this town called Bucklands Beach. Weird name, isn't it? Bucklands Beach. And it was a fairly wealthy suburban area in New Zealand where lots of Asians and lots of Caucasian Kiwis actually lived. And as I told you before, I couldn't speak English very well back then. I still don't, I believe. So I ended up ditching all my all my classmates and just hung out with the Korean-speaking friends because of the language and the cultural barriers that I experienced. So I got close to a few Korean-speaking friends, and we hung out together quite often. You know, we would play basketball together. You know, we would go to like PC방 and like play Dota together. We would play pool together, and we would like just, you know, simply go down to the beach and spend time together. And I would say I had lots of fun hanging out with my high school friends, and I cherish that memories until today. But one of the most memorable things that I still remember very clearly is the time when me and my two other friends went to this place called Eastern Beach. It was only like a 5-minute walk from my house, and it looks kind of like this. Let me show you the picture here. Beautiful, isn't it? Eastern Beach. That's where I used to live. Anyways. So here's how the story goes. One day, my friends and I decided to have lunch together. I was like, hey, bro, let's go and grab some fish and chips together, eh? Right? In Korean. But because we were, teenagers and we were broke, we decided to do a takeout and have it at the beach. And as you might know already, New Zealand is an island, right? So you see the picture here? It's actually the ocean. It's not a lake. It's an ocean, unlike, Toronto, Ontario. So everywhere you go, the national food of New Zealand, because it's, an island, is fish and chips, just like how the UK, their national food is fish and chips, because it's an island, right? So everywhere you go, the most affordable foods you can get are either like the Chinese takeaways or fish and chips. So, as broke teenagers, we bought some fish and chips, all wrapped up in a newspaper, and we headed down to the beach. But here's the thing, as soon as we got there, it started pouring, like raining so hard. So we kind of panicked, so we looked for a shelter, but nothing was there. As you can see, it's a wide open space, right? There's no shelter there. So we actually had no option but to get soaked. So here we were, 3 teenagers running around the beach with soaked up fish and chips and screaming to find a shelter. Right? You can imagine that, right? It was pretty hectic. It was pretty tough, yeah? But all of a sudden, I remembered that there was this small cave under the cliff near the end of the beach, which only appears when it's low tide. As you can see, do you see a little cave thing that I've, marked there, right there? It's a little cave. You can actually access it only when the water is out. And fortunately, it was low tide at the time. So we were able to get in there to stay out of rain. And of course, we knew we couldn't stay there for too long because the water will soon come in. But it was enough time for us to have fish and chips and wait for the rain to stop. So we had our lunch there and we played a few games here and there and came back home when it stopped raining. And even though it was a tough experience of running around, it kind of still, remains as the most memorable time that I shared with my friends. Shared experiences can bring people closer together. They can really bond people together. It doesn't always have to be a fun one to bring people together. It can also be a difficult experience like the one that I experienced before, because through tackling the difficulties together, you form a stronger bond with one another. I mean, if you think about it, the reason why you're so close with your school friends is because you see them every single day and you share the same pain of having to sit through the class every day, right? And on top of that, you also have, some fun hanging out with some of them as well. You play video games with them and whatnot. So whether it's a difficult experience or a fun one, it doesn't matter. What matters the most in friendship is that you have this shared memory with one another. And that is why I always, the pastors or the teachers, they always encourage you to come out to the Bible study on Fridays or to other various church events that happens throughout the year. So we need these shared memories to form a stronger friendship among our students, therefore become a healthier church. That's why we always encourage you to come out and, come out to different events and whatnot. Then here's the thing. Some of you might be wondering, do we even need friends, right? Why do we actually have to do that? Why do we have to, bond as a community? I know it kind of sounds detrimental, but I used to think that way once in my life. Do we even need friends? Come on. Do I even need a friend? And after I went through a huge betrayal from one of my friends, I actually started to think that I myself am the only one that I can fully trust. No one else. So I thought to myself, making friends is a waste of time and energy because they will always abandon me whenever they see fit. So there was one point in my life when I shut everybody out from my life and never cared about anyone else but me. Here's a question. Is this right? Is this what God really wants us to think and act? Well, the answer, you guys know the answer, right? It's no. No. So through studying today's passage, we're going to actually explore the reason why we need real friends in our lives. And we're actually also going to see how we can be real friends to other people as well. And the story we're going to study together is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus. Let's have a look. So many of you would already know how this story goes because it's quite famous. It's a well-known story. I mean, we covered this topic a few months ago during our Bible study as well, before the new grade 7s came up. And it's a passage where we see Jesus' raw emotions. It's a very well-known passage for that. And just in case some of you might not know how the story goes, allow me to explain what happened. So in this town called Bethany, there lived a man named Lazarus. And he was a very close friend of Jesus. One day, Lazarus became really sick, just like me. He became really sick. And he was about to die. I almost died, right, last week. Anyways. So his sisters were worried. So they sent a message to Jesus, and they told him to come quickly. But Jesus didn't go immediately because he knew that God was going to do amazing things through Lazarus' death. So after intentionally staying for a while, Jesus went to Bethany where he found Lazarus already been dead for 4 days, right? And when Lazarus' sister Mary met Jesus, she was grieving with strong emotions. It's like crying and weeping and mourning over the loss of Lazarus. And not only that, not just Mary, but other Jews around Mary were also weeping and mourning over the loss of this man. And when Jesus saw all these people mourning, he was deeply moved. He was like, oh man, he was so moved. And he started to weep with them as well. And after weeping together, Jesus went to the tomb where Lazarus' dead body was laid. And there he prayed to God and commanded dead Lazarus to come out. And then something amazing happens. What happened was that Lazarus came back alive with his hands and feet still wrapped with strips of linen. So lots of Jews who came to visit Mary saw what happened and they started to have faith in Jesus. Oh yeah, Jesus is our Messiah. And they started to have faith in Jesus. And that is how the story ends. Before, a lot of Christians focused narrowly on Jesus' power to even resurrect the dead. When they read this passage, they'll be like, oh man, Jesus is so powerful because he can even raise the dead. That's how, Christians before used to, think a lot throughout this passage. But recently, lots of Christians began to focus more on how Jesus shared his emotions with other people. We all know that Jesus is God, right? And we would never think that it's possible for God to grieve or weep, right? If you think about it, Jesus created the entire universe. And what's in there for him to weep about? If he created the entire universe, why does he have to weep? It doesn't quite click in our heads, right? But as you can see, Jesus was capable of grieving with his friends. He was fully human as well. He had empathy towards those who were hurting, and he was also able to comfort them while they were grieving. So as a real friend, he comforted other people with his words, with his presence, and also with his actions. And here we learn an important lesson about being a real friend. We need friends because real friends comfort one another. And even if you can't find a friend who can give you the support that you need, you don't have to worry about it because Jesus is that one friend who understands and will never let us down. Many of you, except for the grade 7s, would know, but beginning of this year, my wife gave birth to our very first son. No. But 3 days after he was born, he suddenly had difficulty breathing. He was still an infant, right? So we had to call an ambulance and take him to the ER. Because he couldn't breathe, he was actually bleeding from his nose, and everything inside was clogged up with blood. So he couldn't breathe anymore. So he stopped breathing. So our son very quickly became unconscious, and doctors in the ER, they tried everything that they could do. But no matter how hard we prayed, and no matter how hard the doctors tried, our son eventually passed away on that night. So only after being with us for 3 days, God took him back to where he came from. And of course, my wife and I were devastated. We cried day and night for many, many weeks, for many, many months. And everything that had happened around that time is still quite fuzzy in my head. And I can't really recall them very clearly because it was just so traumatic for me. But what I at least vaguely remember is the presence of lots of people during our son's funeral. They were mostly from our church, and some of you sitting here, you guys were there as well to share the pain with us. And you would have never imagined, but when our high C students came to hug me on that day during our funeral, it was the most comforting experience during that funeral. It wasn't the words of consolation from church elders or the message that was preached by one of the pastors, which made me feel better. It was actually our high C students who came to support us, which made me feel much, much comforted. And do you actually know what they did, the high C students who were there? They didn't do anything. They just sat there. They just came. They didn't say anything. They didn't do much. But they were just there for us. And believe it or not, their presence alleviated a lot of pain from me, which I am very, very grateful of. Whether you like it or not, you're going to face painful situations in your life. And as much as we want to just shake it off our shoulders, it's often too daunting to do so. And that's when we need our friends to stick around and just be there for us. Just like how Jesus came to Lazarus and to all those other people who are mourning over the loss of their friends, we also need real friends like Jesus, who's going to stay with us through thick and thin. And not only that, we also need to become that one friend who always shows up when our friend is in pain. So be wise, guys. Be wise in choosing friends, okay? And if you can't find any real friends around you for whatever reason, trust that Jesus is that one good friend who will always stay by your side, sharing the pain with you. So I want to wrap up today's sermon with one last thing. It's to do with the movie Inside Out. It's one of my favorite movies because I find it so true and highly applicable to our lives. It sort of teaches us some valuable lessons and shows us how to deal with our emotions better. Now, in the movie, there is this character named Bing Bong. Bing Bong, I love the name. He's this pink elephant, and he is the imaginary friend of Riley that exists in her mind. I don't know if you would remember the scene, but there's a moment when Bing Bong mourns over the loss of his wagon rocket, and also coming to terms with the reality that he had been forgotten by Riley, who he really loved. And with these two tragedies combined together, he feels terribly sad. It's like crying, really sad, and doesn't know what to do. But when joy and sadness saw Bing Bong crying, they tried to comfort him in their own ways. And what they did were two completely opposite, two different things. Joy tried to quickly move past her friend's pain. She was making, all those funny faces and whatnot. But sadness was ready to feel it with him. Empathy, right? And of course, Bing Bong felt much better after sadness's full presence, so he could get up and walk again. Most of the times, we think that we need to do something for the grieving ones. But that's not true. That's not always true. Yes, sometimes we might need to do something, but that's not always true. Just like how Jesus wept with others in today's passage, you and I just need to be fully present with other people who are weeping. So I want to encourage you today to be that friend who always shows up when someone is in pain. And when you start making yourself available to others, you're going to eventually have real friends around you who will always stay by your side no matter what happens in your life. So Hi-C, go and be the comforting friend just like Jesus. When we open ourselves up and make ourselves more available to others, we're going to come to understand what it means to be a real friend. Okay? So let's just spend some time praying to God. So as we close our eyes, let's just close our eyes. And let's just ask God individually and ask Him to be that friend for us. And let's also decide today that we need to be that friend for others as well. Let's decide and let's pray to God to help us to be that one friend who can offer themselves to others. So why don't we spend some time praying, asking God for wisdom, asking God for courage to put ourselves out there for our friends who need our help, who need our support. So let's just spend just about a minute just to pray to God